Okay, our next speaker is Lena Schlichting, is a senior research specialist at the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, which is a national network of non-profit partners. She's here to talk about current and future needs in Colonias and impacts of climate change. Hi, Lena, whenever you want.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Jose, and thank you everyone for having us today to talk about the needs in Colonias and the impact of climate change. I'm planning to give a brief background on who RCAP is, talk a bit about our work with Colonias and a recent survey that we had, and talk about the impacts of the drought from this year on these communities and climate change in general. So a brief background, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, short RCAP, is a national network of nonprofit partners. Our national office is based in Washington, D.C., and we have 6 regional partners that you can see here on the map, with over 350 technical assistance providers in every state and territory doing the actual boots on the ground work with communities. So we work with rural communities across the country to elevate rural voices and build local capacity to improve the quality of life, but starting at the tap, the water tap. If you go to the next slide, you can see that we served quite a lot of communities in the last fiscal year, so over 1,650 communities all over the country, including the territories. The average community population we served was just over 1,500 people in the community. And in Texas, we served 85 communities. And you see that quite some of those communities we served are along the US-Mexico or Texas-Mexico border. Some of those communities are also colonias. If we go to the next slide, colonias are predominantly low-income communities near the US-Mexico border that often lack access to the basics like water and sewer services. Colonias have mainly Latino residents who are mostly US citizens. And you see that the various government agencies on a federal and state level can define colonias a bit differently. But here's a definition from the US Department of Agriculture and Department of Housing and Urban Development. Most definitions specify a location within 150 miles of the border, so fairly close. Colonias developed in the 1970s and 80s and often started as settlements for immigrant farm workers due to a lack of affordable housing. So they developed through an absence of regulations, high housing demands from low-income earners, and a low supply of available housing combined with a high supply of low-cost land. And the over 2,000 colonias along the US-Mexico border are often small communities that can be quite remote and where in the beginning often promised services like safe drinking water, effective sewer systems, or paved roads as coming soon when the land was sold to residents. RCAP's work with colonias is primarily funded under the USDA Rural Development Technical Assistance and Training Grant Program under our Colonias project, and is implemented on the ground by 2 of our regional partners, Communities Unlimited, they serve colonias in Texas, and the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, RCAC, which serves several states in the West, but for colonias, Arizona, California, and New Mexico. And in case you don't know that yet, Texas has more colonias than the other 3 states combined. So I think it's about 1,800 colonia communities in Texas. The technical assistance providers that regularly work with colonias communities on the ground provide training and technical assistance to them and their water systems to help them access funding resources and increase capacity to help move towards a long-term sustainability. And during the recent grant year, we provided technical assistance to colonias through 44 projects, serving nearly 120 colonias that were in need of this assistance and helped to leverage $80 million in funds. If we go to the next slide, we can see that in fiscal year 2022, we sampled 251 colonias, 128 of them were in Texas, to get updated information about the communities, to understand ongoing new concerns, to also target funding and assistance better, and their current challenges. So we were asking technical assistance providers what they kind of have for specific concerns, also looking at drinking water and wastewater. Drinking water concerns, for example, might be unsafe water, and wastewater concerns might be, for example, overflowing sewer systems after a storm, which is not ideal. The majority of sampled colonias in Arizona, California, and New Mexico were listed under drinking water concerns, but Texas only had 17% of the sample colonias listed under this concern, and 23%, so nearly a quarter of sample colonias under the study in Texas reported concerns about their wastewater services, so a little higher. I just want to mention that this sample that we had is kind of obviously skewed by design to the communities that have worked with a technical assistance provider, because we had the contact with them, and therefore likely paint a rosier picture compared to communities that have not had access to technical assistance at all over the last many years. So colonias without access to the support may have significantly higher concerns and needs for water services. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. While most people in the sample colonias that work with technical assistance providers get their running water from the tap and have wastewater services available, affordability is still a major challenge, and water and wastewater services can be difficult to afford for many colonia communities. And I also wanted to mention here that generally the water bills in colonias can be several times actually higher than a nearby community in that area. So it can be over proportionally more than, for example, what you might be used to pay for your water bill. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, it has become even more challenging to pay for these services, especially due to job losses, inflation, rising prices across the country. In 2015, we had technical assistance providers look at all colonias to assign priority scores to indicate the order of need in the community for water and wastewater services, and also whether a water-based health hazard was present. And now, a few years later, we looked at nearly 70 communities, which is obviously a very small subset, to assess them again, and found that most communities that we were able to assess actually increased in priority and need. And also in Texas, all the assessed communities we looked at were increasing. And why is this? This was often due to new water quality violations, which can be caused by changes to source water quality, struggles to keep up with operations and maintenance need, lack of loss of capacity to react to administrative compliance orders, or just complete funding applications, aging infrastructure, climate change impacts, and the pandemic as well. And colonias can be often very quick at repairing urgent issues like a broken pump or a leak, but they often have a limited capacity to proactively operate and manage utilities for the future. So things like data management and collection can be difficult because it might be challenging to even hire a water operator, which we really have a shortage of in this country, and also just manage data while often lacking even a stable broadband connection. And online reporting is required, so there can be issues of non-compliance just through that. So in general, affordability, monitoring, and asset management are often challenges, but they're really important to the long-term sustainability of communities. And with technical and financial assistance and enhanced monitoring and some good asset management plans, that would at least alleviate some of the existing affordability issues and help to improve drinking water and wastewater access. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the drought from this year. And just one, I think it's one slide back, can it be? Yeah, if you can just go to the slide, perfect, thank you. So colonias are often in rural, unincorporated and remote areas and often have aging water infrastructure. Under the drought, the pressure in water lines often doesn't function to 100% like it should, which makes them deteriorate faster. And this lack of pressure can come from insufficient water in the distribution system due to declining groundwater resources and just a higher water demand than what is currently in the system. Lack of pressure in pipes can lead to a chance for bacteria and sediment entering the supplied water. And TCEQ, so the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, has been testing a lot of water, which was still safe for the most part. But the water supplied to some colonias has been smelly, cloudy, smelled like fish, which our technical assistance provider said leads to also the customers just not trusting the water. No trust in their tap water because it may look weird and smell weird can often mean that the residents purchase water from a vending machine where municipal water got treated. So for example, if you go to a grocery store, you might see the machines where you can fill reverse osmosis in your like gallon or 5-gallon jugs, which is usually like about 30 cents a gallon, but it's definitely an extra burden on households. At times, colonias are below the advised water pressure threshold from TCEQ and are then under a week-long boil advisory, meaning the customers need to boil their water before consumption a certain amount of time. And while cities with a large customer base are able to upgrade the infrastructure infrastructure in general. Colonias might just have 100 connections, so they don't have a customer base to actually finance upgrades they need, and often might also not qualify for a loan due to that. And when Colonia do take a loan and are able to kind of qualify for it to do the repairs they really need or upgrades, like for example, replacing a water line or a booster, that often requires water rate increases. And water rates in Colonias can be, as I already mentioned, significantly higher than in other areas in, for example, Texas. And these increased rates can make water services less affordable, burden households even more, especially when the customers, for example, on a fixed income. So in general, many Colonia residents have challenges paying their water utility bills. They often try to adapt their water use to save money, and some of them who are not able to get their payments in time actually get water access shut off. The increased heat is also connected to faster rusting of the ground storage tanks that hold the water. And when a tank is rusty or even starts to leak, it needs to be shut off for safety reasons and more. And longer term needs replacement. But a smaller community often has just 3 to 4 tanks. So you're losing like 25% of the water supply that you actually have in your system. And as was talked a lot before, the summer has been really hot in Texas and Southwest. In Southwest Texas, we had over 100 days with over 100 degrees. And the impacts on water supply in the Colonias have been worse, according to the technical assistance providers who we talked with, than actually over the last couple of years. So some wells in Southwest Texas needed replacement. 3 communities one of our assistance providers worked with actually needed a new well because the current one was just lacking water production in the peak season from May to September. But the communities weren't able to take on additional debt, so they needed to take a loan that is now requiring the community to pay higher rates. While there are emergency loans available to access money with a faster turnaround, because applications can take a long time, this still leads to a higher cost for the community. And to conserve water and allow wells in the whole system to refill, Colonia communities often have water use restrictions. So fairly common is that sprinklers may not be allowed in the summer, but it can also lead to water shut-offs for the whole household. For example, from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. That means a family cannot access running water during this time. So that's quite an impact. If you go to the next slide.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Colonia communities have often dilapidated homes that aren't insulated very well, often don't have air conditioning, leading to the heat impacts that Kijun already just talked about. And water shutoffs don't only impact private households, but also the agricultural industry. And the agricultural sector, like we heard more today, can get their water access shut off, which has impact on farmers, crop workers, who also might live in nearby Colonias. And local businesses in Colonias are inclined to move to areas with less restrictive water use, also for fire prevention and suppression need. And the younger generation in general also tends to move away due to socioeconomic reasons, which are only in part correlated to the water supply, but also a bit. And if you still go to the next slide, we have reported that Colonias our assistance providers work with have been impacted by a severe weather event, for example, the big freeze in Texas 2 years ago in the winter. Extreme weather events are predicted to increase due to climate change and over average threaten the health and well-being of more vulnerable populations. Also, at least in Southwest Texas, another challenge is that we have increased frequency and severity of flooding due to hurricanes, leading often to severe issues with drainage after flooding. Wildfires can also be an issue, which can also get contaminants into the system if kind of pipes get damaged. And as water sources become less reliable due to declining groundwater table and less surface water flow, it's really important to diversify the water sources in community. So not just have one single source. And addressing existing challenges in Colonias is important, but also planning for climate adaptation is really important, but is unfortunately rare due to a lack of resources and staff capacity. In general, Colonias are experiencing continuous challenges due to historical underfunding, and climate change is just making things worse. So continued assistance and help with funding are important to improve and maintain water services in Colonias. And in general, while Colonias, like other disadvantaged communities, may qualify for funding under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, short BIL, they often lack the capacity to apply and compete for this funding on their own, and just must be aware of this funding opportunity in the first place. And I think that is my time. If you have any questions, I am happy to try to answer them. And thank you very much for listening. And here is our website, contact, and a link to the report in case the slides are getting out.
Thank you, Lena. If someone has any questions for Lena, please raise your hands. Well, I have my question. One question: when this poor water infrastructure totally fails and they don't have access for drinking water from a public water system, what they do, where they get the water?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in Texas, about 5 or 8% of Colonias actually don't have some kind of water system delivering water. So it is a bit, if you kind of consider that it's about 1,800 communities. So a small percentage of residents get their water from own unregulated wells, which are not under the Safe Drinking Water Act. But it can also be informal water sharing solutions, like, for example, having rainwater barrels, peer-to-peer exchange within networks. It can be filled from tanker trucks. So in some communities, you might have trucks coming in delivering water, but that has more opportunity for contaminant exposure. And studies are also confirming that there is a higher amount of contaminants in the water than from more municipal supply. So if you don't have safe tap water or also just no trust into it, you might, as I mentioned, kind of purchase from vending machines, which is really more expensive, has an effort. And when a household needs to haul water, it's time consuming, it's expensive, it might require a car, extra gas costs. So it really is a burden on communities. And lastly, there are options for decentralized water treatments that you might know. For example, you might have a point of use treatment at the kitchen sink. Some of you might have sediment, a carbon, or typical reverse osmosis filter installed. But that maybe a solution also requires installation, is a pretty big upfront cost, requires regular maintenance that often is not really done according to research, and it's just also not an optimal way to get drinking water. And I think Jay has a question.
Yes, Jay, you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lena. Yeah, my question surrounds kind of the theme of our workshop here, of our meeting, is how do you account and monetize the costs? And it seems like, as hard as it is doing this in any of the sectors we're looking at, this is especially challenging because of the very off-the-grid nature of Colonias. So a lot of the issues go underreported, underaccounted for, and just how does one begin to approach this challenge of trying to monetize what the costs are?
That is a really good question. So unfortunately, we don't really have any numbers. I think partly because we're mostly doing applied technical assistance. There is a bit research in this, but I have not been actually able to find any, in a way, monetized impacts. I feel like challenges are that it is, in a way, just not that easy to kind of get the relationship with the Colonia to kind of even talk about this. I'm actually curious if anyone has any good suggestions how to kind of monetize this and potentially include it. So I thought I was really glad that some of you were able to, in a way, present in these communities, also because you're working on this. But I'm thinking, I mean, one thing to, in a way, monetize it might to kind of see funding applications. That's, for example, often how there's a kind of assessment every 5 years in the US done in a way, what is the kind of need in the water sector? It's called the DWINSA, Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Assessment, something. They kind of are basically looking at what are applications that a community is doing and in a way upscale that for small communities. So they're looking at like 2% of communities in the nation and say, in average, they have this need, let's scale it up by the state. So I think maybe one could potentially do something like this to kind of see what kind of applications just for like water infrastructure upgrades are Colonias making, and then try to, in a way, upscale that kind of just based on either the state or kind of like also connected to kind of the water problems that the community might have. But again, it's a little challenging because only because you don't make an application, it does not mean you don't have need. But
Right.
somehow often it's kind of coming back to you need a technical assistance provider or some organization, something local that helps you to kind of figure partly out in a way even what your needs are, because you might know you're struggling, but not exactly what you need to do to even kind of get a preliminary engineering report. So I wonder if this might be kind of an option, but again, like with probably a pretty big error margin. And otherwise, I'm wondering if something like surveys of households, just in a way, what the usual payments are. Like there are surveys that somehow they are burdened, that I think they pay like a certain amount over. But yeah, I hope that's helpful, but happy for more ideas.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. In fact, it sounds like unfortunately those most in need are least likely to have time or wherewithal to make applications.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We need
Good
to.
question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. We need to